Dinah Barry, 2019 marks the 400th anniversary of the first Africans sold into slavery to the United States. Where did they come from?
They came from different parts of West Africa, but they were actually taken on a ship and captured by the Dutch, and then captured again off of a Portuguese ship. So when you look at their journey, there were two different points where they were taken on different ships.
How do we know about them?
We know about them from ship records. We also know about them from early records from Virginia, colonial Virginia records. And we know very little information about them, but we have bits and pieces for their early history.
And what do we know?
We know that there was 20, and they arrived. They were not listed as enslaved, they were listed as servants. We know that they came and they were pretty sick when they got off the ships. And they lived in Virginia, and some of them then created families and were the first generations of African Americans in this country.
And who were they? I mean, children, women, men?
Mostly men and women. There was about 2 or 3 women, and the rest of them were men. And they had their own families, and they established the early communities in Virginia.
And their ages?
Middle ages, 17 to 24, I think it was.
How did slavery then expand from that point?
So slavery expanded gradually. It wasn't so much an institution in the initial period, but as time went on and as they saw that African Americans or Africans were a good source, quote unquote, good source of labor. I don't like using that phrase, but they were a source of labor. They didn't know the land. They couldn't run away. They were surviving, unlike Native peoples who they did try to enslave. And they decided that Africans were the laborers of choice at that time. But for the most part, slavery was a racialized institution that came gradually over time.
What pushed it to become an institution over time?
Well, clearing land, finding crops, staple crops like tobacco, later on sugar, rice, and other crops that they could use to produce the goods that were then sold in other parts of the world. In 1793, a little bit later, a generation later, 2 generations later, the invention of the cotton gin and the opening of new lands, Louisiana Purchase. You have lands that's rich, fertile soil to then produce more and more goods. You need more laborers. The slave trade takes off, and they continue to bring in more people.
Is that what you meant by the economics of slavery?
Yes. The economics of slavery have to do with the technology, the crops, the capitalism that was fueling the market in enslaved people. The desire to purchase and sell and trade enslaved people was also part of the economics of slavery.
And they put a price on the slaves. How did they do that? And why? Why was it necessary, I guess?
Every enslaved person was given a value, and they were appraised on an annual basis in their records of their planters and their owners and enslavers. And that was often done for tax purposes. They had to keep track of who they owned. And enslaved people were given a specific value based on the amount of work that they could do in a given year, or what kind of laborers they thought that they were at that time. And every year that number sometimes changed if they were sick, if they injured themselves. So there was a monetary value that was an appraisal. And at the market, though, they were then given a sale price or a market value. And that was one that was sort of bartered, and a value that was used to trade when people were negotiating. And those values were a little bit higher than the appraised values, but the market value was the sale price of an enslaved person on a particular day.
Are there records, and what kind of records show these transactions?
Very, very detailed records. One of the first records that we historians use are ledger books that planters and enslavers had, where they kept meticulous records of the day-to-day values of enslaved people, the work that they were doing, the weather, the crops, how much people were picking, if they were picking cotton, how much rice they were gleaning, tobacco, wheat, all the crops.
By person?
Most planters did, yes. Literally, or they would group them by saying, like, 5 slaves doing this, 7 enslaved people doing, a particular task. These people are in this field. So it's very, very meticulous record. So we have this information about what they were doing, and we also have their valuations were also in the records as well.
What kind of prices were they putting on these people?
So from 0 to 10, when they were young, most boys and girls had the same value. And around that, in between the 19th century, most of them were priced around $100 to $200, which in today's money is a lot more than that. So when we're looking at the values of enslaved people, when we see in records, we see anywhere from $100 to $5,000 in the 19th century. But that in today's numbers are anywhere from $30,000 to $200,000 per person. So these were very expensive human commodities.
And how often were they sold and bought?
The average enslaved person was sold 4 to 5 times in their lifetime. So this means that they were changing hands more than once. They were having new owners and new people that they had to work with, new families that they had to get adjusted to, and it changed the way they looked at the institution of slavery as well.
In what way?
Well, one, if you had a particular owner that you were living with and you had lived with for most of your life, and then if you're then sold to somebody else, it's a new community, you don't know the personalities, you don't know the work rhythms, and so you sort of have to kind of connect and find out what that plantation is like and what that estate or that small farm is like. And you also might be dealing with the loss of, being away from and separated from family members that you had lived with prior to that. You may have been separated from a parent or a cousin or an uncle or an aunt. And so now it's a new community that they have to figure out how to adjust to life in this new space.
How did the slaves see themselves? Do we know? And did they know their value of, the price that people were putting on them?
Yes. So enslaved people often made comments, and we have these comments from a number of records, from slave narratives, from personal papers, from abolitionist records, from newspapers, where they'll talk about, and you look for these traces of comments from them, and they'll say things like, my value was $600, but I didn't care. The monetary value that they put on my body was nothing to the value that I had for myself. And I call that their soul value. There was a certain value that could not be commodified, it could not be monetized, that enslaved people felt that nobody could touch. And it didn't matter what the master's price was, it didn't matter what the people were arguing, the bid callers were arguing at a market scene, that didn't matter to them. What mattered was their soul, and they could care less if they commanded a high price or a quote-unquote bargain. That didn't matter to them.
Reading those kind of comments, what impact would that have on you?
It had a really big impact because I think most of the scholarship on slavery up until like the early 2000s didn't always think about what enslaved people felt or thought. We did studies where we talked about the enslaved community and we tried to get to their dinner tables and know what life was like in the cabins, but we really didn't use as many quotes from them, and just to think about what happens when we talk about the market from their perspective, what happens when we talk about the auction block from their perspective. So now we have, we're looking at asking these questions and we're looking for those answers. We're finding first-person testimony of enslaved people sharing what they thought about their values, what they thought about the auctioneer, what they thought about the owner, how they felt about being on a ship or being traded. And that information is really, really useful. And it's very personal as well.
And the title of your book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave. Why from womb to grave?
So I was looking at how enslaved people were valued from every stage of their lives. And I noticed early on in the research that enslaved people were priced before they were born. And so that when mothers, they would look at the future fertility of a woman, and they would project how many children she could potentially have and how many healthy children she could potentially have. And thinking about that, then they were valued from preconception to what I argue post-mortem. So they were being valued before they were born, where mothers, there was a strong sort of distraction trying to understand women's menstrual cycles, trying to understand how healthy they were their menstrual cycles regular or irregular. They were sometimes where they would put a warranty on their uterus, where they would guarantee that this woman would have X number of children in X number of years, and if not, a person that purchased them could go then come to sue and get their money back. And we have cases in the legal record where people were sued because women didn't give birth. So this is very detailed records, very personal records that are in county courthouses, that are posted on broadsides and flyers that were posted throughout the South with women and their names on it and comments about their fertility.
It's astonishing how closely these owners paid attention.
Yes.
And the details.
This was a market that these were their products. These were human products, by the way, but these were from their perspective, they had to make sure they were maximizing their profit on their laborers. And they wanted to make sure they were making good investments, all these business terms, like good investments, and so that the return on their investment would be worth the value that they put forward to purchase them.
Any stories stand out from your research?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wrote about when I was talking about their internal value was the soul value of enslaved people. and that is that internal value that they had for themselves. One of my favorite stories was a story of a man named Isaac, who was planning a rebellion with a number of other enslaved people, and somehow they found out about it and they put him in jail, and they were trying to find out who else was involved in this particular uprising or the planning of this uprising, and he wouldn't tell anybody who it was, and they pressured him and they asked questions, and he kept saying, "Take me, I'm the one, just take me." And they sent his minister who had baptized him and brought him to God, but sent him to the jail to have a conversation with him. They had like a 2 or 3 hour conversation. They were praying together, they were crying, and he said, "Isn't God a God of the black and of the white?" This is what Isaac is asking his minister. He's like, "Why am I, held in chains? Where's God in all this?" The minister was so ashamed and he didn't know what to say. He left. The next day, Isaac was on the gallows getting ready to be hung. They put the rope around his neck. He was standing there with a number of other gentlemen, and they said, "Do you have any final words?" And he said, "Just take me, I'm the one. I will die a noble death if you just take me." And before they could pull the latch to raise the floor, he lifted up his feet and hung himself. And I argue that that's Isaac's expression of his soul value.